Hey guys, welcome to the Learn Feng Shui podcast, where you'll learn Feng Shui from a classical point of view, taking out the myth and superstition. So if you're interested in learning Feng Shui, Chinese astrology, all things Chinese metaphysics, as well as the superstitions and myths that connect it all, you'll enjoy learning Feng Shui with me. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. So excited for my guest today, Zac Lui. I actually was kind of made aware or, kind of found him through another Feng Shui practitioner. She has shared one of his videos. He has a YouTube channel, Queen City Curios and Apothecary. Everything's going to be linked, of course, in the show notes. But video entitled Lu Ban Jing, a Chinese grimoire of magic and esoteric Feng Shui with Jason Reed. So I'm in all things esoteric. Yep. And so I actually just messaged Zac, and I was like, hey, let's make an episode because this stuff is just pretty interesting. And as we started kind of talking and connecting, I was like, man, this guy's pretty cool. So a very extensive bio here. Let's get into it. Zac Lui, leading expert in Eastern metaphysics. He's a shaman folk priest, registered acupuncturist, and a master of medical qigong. In addition, he's an Usi Reiki master teacher, a certified trainer from Results Over Image Institute, studying directly with Andrea Vitamus for many years, has specialized in Pure Land Buddhist and Taoist magics, and is an international radio co-host. Zachary also is trained in Shaolin Kung Fu and internal martial arts, as well as Yang Tai Chi Chuan and Bagua Zhang. Hope I said that correctly. Currently, Zachary teaches classical Chinese medicine, Qigong, Usi Reiki, meditation, and stillness. And he is considered a powerful folk priest amongst his peers in the community. So let's get into ancestor worship and Yin House Feng Shui with Zac Lui. Welcome, Zac. I'm so happy to have you on today.
Thank you for having me on, Candace.
Today, we want to talk about the concept of ancestor worship, honoring your ancestors, veneration, and Yin House Feng Shui. But before we get into all of that, Zac, tell us how you got started on just in this field in general. What made you come to Chinese metaphysics?
What made me came in terms of the Chinese metaphysics was not that expected. My background was actually I was doing dating and relationship coaching. That's what I was priming myself for in the teens. I was learning from the top people in the industry about body language, hypnosis, conversation, communication, all that type of stuff, and basically helping men be men and not really, getting over their issues of what that would mean. So that's what I was training on because, well, myself, it started really young where I'm like, I want to talk to this girl. I can't talk to this girl. That's where it started for me. So then I kind of went a whole slew of things. And eventually I got into more what we discussed as the neo-tantra route of things. And I started to learn from that. And then I got interested in spirituality, saying like, why aren't I going back to my roots? I love this Hindu stuff or I love the neo-tantra stuff, but there's so much more. What else can I do? And it was from that point I basically made a commitment to myself saying, well, I will figure out how to do magic. I will figure out how to do spirituality and let's dive into it. This was a hard decision I made in my team, right? Because everything was getting more, I usually describe it as monochrome. When you can start figuring things out and you're like, it's boring. You need a little more flair. You want the technicolor. So that's where that was my pursuit of spirituality. Is like, how do I become a better person? It wasn't for anything else other than self-development purposes. And I wanted a grounded, results-driven approach to things. So from that point, someone in my network said, hey, you should learn off of a Chinese medicine person. And I'm looking at them. I'm like, dude, really? Stick, mud, like needles? Why would I do? How does this have to do with anything? And then the carrot on the stick for me was, well, you said you want to do magic. Chinese medicine kind of has Taoist roots. And I'm like, oh, now you have my interest. You're saying this is part of Taoist magic, which there's no literature on, and I could school for this professionally, get a job as a wizard type of thing. This is kind of cool, maybe, right? So I go on to apprentice a family lineage for Chinese medicine. And at the same time, it's as they say, when the student's ready, the master appears. And I was doing Qigong work at this point, like lots of qigong, and I'm still studying marketing at this time. This is like early years, and it went to a point where I was getting actually radical results with qigong that most people could not get. Like, but I was having the time to do it, so I literally was doing 4 hours of qigong every day in my teens, like late teens, early 20s. And I was getting lots of effects where it would almost break reality. And I was like, what the hell am I doing? There has to be like a scientific method to this. I don't like, I get it, like you breathe in, you do the movement, but the why was the biggest thing. And even prior to this, I was doing something called hermetic, right? So this is Western esoteric tradition magic.
Yeah.
And because I couldn't find anything on Chinese stuff other than meditate, do Shaolin stuff. I'm like, but then when I started to do the Qigong, things started to kind of fit together like a puzzle piece because I was doing those basic hermetic exercises like go stare at a candle, go look at the black mirror, do these energy exercises to magnetize. And I'm like, okay, this sort of makes sense. But what I really wanted to do during that time was call spirit. I was like, yeah, I want to do this. How do I do this? Well, you have to do all this work, right? So I kept at it. I did the qigong, and then after a certain amount of time, Andrea Vitamus, author of Hands on Chaos Magic, he was doing a tour and he was just doing a sigil magic class. And I remember literally there was an email from the person I talked to. It's like, hey, you gotta meet this guy. He is badass. Like you want to do stuff, he is the person. I'm like, oh, all right, whatever. Let's check this out, right? Because I don't know what I don't know. So this is very much like I know Qigong, so I took the workshop. And Andrea has a psychology background. He's very data driven, right? He has multiple masters. So this is like an author that actually like I could relate to because I was like, for me, I was already all interested in this stuff. So I'm like, all right, like this seems pretty grounded to me. And he started to talk about sigils. He started to talk about like how trance states matter and how to progress step by step in this. And I'm like, yeah, this is gold. This is complete gold. This tour. This is where I started working through this because I have an aspiration. I'm like, I want to do that. I don't know what that was, but that's what I'm looking to do.
Yeah.
So I started working through it. Things start changing in my life. And at that point, I contacted him. I'm running a men's self development group at this time. And I said, hey, the guys need this. How much is it going to cost? We're flying you up here or we'll pay for your hotel, whatever it is. This is the next step for men's self development. So we get him up here. He does another massive chaos matinee, and people's lives are changed completely. After that, he gave me an invite to go down to the States. And then I started to go down to the States as much as I could to learn from him directly. And then I started to just go there consistently. Eventually, he took me on as a student. And from there, went through lots of different types of growth.
Yeah.
And the great thing around this idea of chaos magic is it's a meta system. So you can apply for whatever system like perspective you want. It's like eating food. You like Chinese food, you need fire, you need water, and you need a pot. That's all basic cooking. So chaos magic says, what is the basic cooking tools you need for any magic system? From that point, you add whatever twists you want, but every single system has these techniques or has this formula to make it work.
That's so fascinating. And you make some really good points about one. I think people don't realize that there's, more aspects of, so we have, our feng shui, but then we have that falls under the five arts of, Chinese metaphysics, which, magic does encompass.
Mm-hmm.
The more esoteric falling under what's considered mountain, but also Qigong would
Yeah.
be too, And so I think a lot of people don't realize that, and it all uses all the same elements, the same concepts, And so really when have one, you have feng shui, you have your five elements, and the yin and yang. In Chinese medicine, we have the five elements and the yin and yang. And I think, just the awareness, like that it all is this really the system that works together.
Well, it's a paradigmal system, right?
Mhm.
Like it's coming from Chinese culture. Chinese culture has certain principles, viewpoint of how the world is. So in Chinese culture, it's coming from a point of one, if we go to the straight shamanic connections, your days of the week, all 10 days in the historical lunar solar calendar are actual royal aristocrats. That's dead veneration right off the bat, which fits into our topic. Then we can start saying, well, is it yin yang and five phases and eight trigrams and the I Ching and book of changes? What is it? It's all of that. So we in Chinese culture, it came from the Han Dynasty, particularly when they codified everything. Before that, everyone was just doing free for all. So like, I do this, you do this, cool beans. But eventually, we get to a formulated school of thought from the Han Dynasty, which they would deem classical Chinese thought. This is why most people will say Han people or Tang people later on being another dynasty. But they're formulating the cosmological sequence in Chinese culture that's under a bureaucracy at this point. So they said yin and yang, that's the start of our inception of the universe. Then you get what's the next thing? The Trinity, the heaven, person, earth. Then you get the four directions. Then you get the five phases. Then you get the six stages or the six different seats of power, which is luck, right? Then you get into the types of chi, and then we can go on. And that's a whole cosmological narrative that everyone fits
Yeah.
into. But that was all formulated from hodgepodge before the Han Dynasty. So this is important to understand that this is a coherent system, and it doesn't matter what one, like, we can say the five arts, or we could say the eight types of schools. In Chinese medicine, we would say like you have your eight branches, right? So that gets into mountain, that gets into feng shui, that gets into bata and astrology and all this. When I was doing all that esoteric training, I was also doing dual learning for Chinese medicine families that came from lineages that did this directly from the imperial palace. So they were the ones actually treating the last emperor, right? So I've been very fortunate. I've been standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to this whole understanding of Chinese metaphysics, magic, and it's basically how do you skew the probability of the world to make your life better?
When you started looking at Chinese medicine, starting Chinese medicine, you've discovered you had a connection to your ancestors before. And again, I think it really is something that is lost kind of in the Western world. We, maybe we visit a tomb or we visit a grave, but we don't have the level of like veneration, like the tomb sweeping days or, the things like that we go and do and honor the ancestors. And so I think, that is something that's lost a little bit is the connection to the ancestors. And of course, yin house feng shui, it is a lot about making sure our ancestors have a good feng shui spot that their descendants, us can prosper. How did you discover kind of that connection to your ancestors? What did that look like for you?
That was actually a tragic time in my life, right? So this is where, I'll be straight on the air. This is like I'm okay with it now because I've had the support and things like that, and I had the training from Andrea. That training from Andrea got me through the tragedy. So unfortunately, our house burned down, and a family member died. So that was extremely depressing for me because literally I got raised with that person. Like it was my grandmother. So this is like it was very trying for me on that. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to go down to the States and Andrea was able to get me through things and said, "Hey, do your basic training." And he was, and everyone down there was a great support network for me. And then I kept doing the exercises. But in the moment, I did the basic energy exercises that he taught me. And I say they're basic, but they are like the things that get you through stuff, right? This is like you hope you never go through a tragedy like I did. And
I'm so
then
sorry.
like you get to apply it and you're like, okay, this stuff actually works. Because I went to a psychologist after because it was so tragic. And literally the psychologist and therapist said, I got nothing for you. Like literally, I explained every single thing. I was like, "This is my routine. This is my meditation work. This is how I'm dealing with it." And through all the skills that Andrea taught me, the psychologist literally kept saying, "I don't have anything for you to say. We're just going to sit here for the next hour." But really, like, I got nothing for you, right? If you want to talk about things, we can. I talked, but really, they're like, I got no plan for you. So that's how well I bounced back. However, during the funerary rite this is where Andrea came up and he acted as a priest for my grandmother on things. And, there's various processes around what funerary rites are. However, we had to go scope out the grave beforehand. Like that's a pretty standard thing. And before this,
Yeah.
understand, we used to go to the grave as Chinese people, and we used to like, oh, you brush the grave and you feed them and all this. To me, that was always very superficial and it was like I was getting introduced to how to do necromancy work, right? Working with the dead in general through all the training Andrea gave me. And I'm literally at the grave of my grandmother looking at the pit. And so we're doing the scouting, we go through their funerary rites, and literally, like, I get this impression. And it was actually a confrontational type of impression because I'm raw at this point. It's like, a few days later, it was a tragic situation. I barely got out alive myself. And this is where I'm completely raw and I literally feel spirit on her grave. And I'm like, fuck this. Like I'm literally like I'm already someone that can do something. Like I was trained enough at that point. I'm already doing like intro priest work, right? Like this is when I'm at that stage of my training. So this is where I'm like, mofo's going to be going into some jars if I don't get some answers because I'm pissed, right? And they're like, whoa, 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 we're here. And I'm like, yeah, you're here on my grandmother's grave and you're about to die, even though you're a spirit. I don't care, right? So this is where I'm already
Yeah.
not having it. And they said, well, no, like, understand, like, we mean no threat. We're actually family. And I'm like, prove it. Like, that's like, I'm already like, and I can do divination, and I can do all these things to verify. So they say a few things to me. I'm like, let me trip this out. If this is wrong, you're in a jar and you'll be buried in the grave. I'll promise you that. Right. So this is where I'm already raw from all this work. And this is before the funerary rates that Andrea does, obviously. So, or a little bit after, it's a little bit gelled. But regardless, there was a threat implied by me because I'm pissed that someone's on my grave that raised me. So at this point, I'm able to verify things. I do divinations, I do some meditations. I'm not really doing ancestor work at this point. And I wasn't really doing dead work at this point, though I was exposed to it. I'm just learning about this, right? So this is where I asked my family, I'm like, hey, does this sound legit in terms of, again, my family doesn't really do open stuff, like we lost that connection. But I was able to verify, I'm like, did grandma do or say something? Because I wouldn't have any recollection of this, obviously, right? And then they're like, yeah, that's actually true. So we have verified evidence. And then I put up the second anti-challenge to these spirits saying, okay, if this is true, you should be able to tell me certain things about myself that I only know about. And they did. So at that point, I'm still skeptical. I'm hella skeptical, remember, at this point. So I'm like, all right, fine. You've passed the test. Let's see if this actually works. So then I get their name, I meditate with them, I call them up, and I'm like, hey, is this true? And then there's a whole process of getting to know your ancestors, right? So I actually formally start getting an ancestor altar built at this point, and being like, if you two are my contact points because you were guarding my grandmother's grave, that's cool. Because usually you don't work with anyone at the ancestor table unless you have ancestors that you
Yeah.
knew in life, right? I had no one die at this point. So I had no actual ancestors. No one would talk to me about like great grandparents. Like, who knows them? Nobody, right? I never had exposure to them. So this is almost the start of my ancestor altar at this point because I had to do a confrontational conversation. And they were able to pull through and get me results through different works of with ancestor table work. And that's where, again, Andrea taught me as a first rule of thumb, like, you work with your ancestors. They have your back no matter what, because you should be expecting something because family has family's back. I can talk to a nature spirit. I can talk to the angels. I can talk to any other spirits. They don't really care. But you know who does care? Your family cares that you have a roof over your head and you have descendants that pass on, right? Or you have people that you can support, even if you choose not to have children, that you can get something out there so the family continues in some shape or way. So they are actually biased for you being successful, right? Now, some people might say, well, I don't understand. Maybe, they go through different experiences where they don't know their parents and they had like foster things where they were orphaned. If you meditate enough and you have an active altar, you'll find them. And we do this consistently at deeper down the rabbit hole where we have those ancestor meditations. Like anytime Halloween pops up, we always have a public ritual or public meditation for people to connect to their ancestors because it's that important. Yes, it's the time of the dead. And yes, it's the time when the veil's the shortest when it comes to more Western tradition. However, with that, this is a great time to interact with your ancestors and your dead because if you have that option, they'll always be rooting for you. And this is why even in our public temple space, like anyone in Toronto, if you're in Toronto, 607 Gerrard Street East, Unit 401, we're on the fourth floor. We have a public temple and we have an actual dead altar to multiple psychopomps and lords of the dead. And you will get connected to your ancestors because we have a direct mirror that you can do a meditation with instructions. So if you don't know what you're doing, you're like, I don't know, go to our altar if you're in Toronto and follow the instructions with the QR code. And from there, you're going to be able to connect with your ancestors because one of the lords of the dead is going to bring you to your ancestors and pull them forward who love you. And then that's the start of your ancestor altar. Right. So this is where not everyone has access to ancestor space or altar space. And we have a full room for you. And it's pretty pimp. You get all the rituals. We
Nice.
have all the spirits there. It's really like a love of the community and the community supporting us.
Talking about the ancestor altar, do you set it up? I know within like when I we learned feng shui, I studied with a master in Singapore, but he has like his resident like Chinese master that studies with us. And he goes over like this whole thing of it's like one session of altar setup and placement and where to set your ancestor plaques and they shouldn't be higher than the deities and all this stuff. Do you set it up traditionally or do you have like a more
No,
intuitive
not
way you
really.
just
You just,
yeah.
it's more intuitive. It's
Mhm.
again, it's one of these things like, even the ancestors right now. It's one of these things where the typical idea is I use a white altar cloth because, at least in the way the tradition I was taught in, which is more voodoo, right? Which is about community and the dead. This is where white is purity. Now in Chinese culture, you'd be like, well, that's death. Okay, match to match, it doesn't matter. But we're going to assume it's purity. Then you always want like a glass of water at this point, right? The glass of water is so they can go through the dead waters. And every culture generally says the underworld is associated with water. Even in Chinese culture, we say it's like yellow springs in the most historic context,
Yeah.
right? So you have the
Yeah.
water there that they can move through. And then you have the physical food offerings, whatever they actually liked in life. So this is where you have to kind of know what they actually liked in life per se. So for myself, again, I got Asian ancestors. So I might give them fruit, right, as a physical offering, but you can use grains, you can use bread, right? And then you give that as a physical thing for them to eat. You can also have fire because fire is illuminating, right? And it brings light to them. So they might be in the underworld, like, we don't know what's happening, but they see the light, so they get drawn to it, but it also invigorates them to the physical world. So the candle's always warming them up, right? Because it's cold in the underworld. So this is where they have food, they have the fire, you have a glass of water there, and then usually you do incense. At that point, the incense is just to help with the smell, right? In Chinese culture, we use the incense in particular to like raise them up further. And you can do lots of work with the ancestors. And typically, you have 4 stones from your neighborhood that you would collect from a meditative trance state, and you would put them on the corners to symbolize this is my home. And that's something you would do. So you would refresh the water every week. You give new food every week. Maybe you put flowers, and then you give unique items to each of your ancestors. Maybe it's a photo that represents them. Maybe it's it could be a statue that represents them. It just depends what they want. But this is the basic ingredients for an ancestor altar. Now, where should the placement be? Wherever it's convenient. Let's be honest. Like, do you want to see your grandma? Does your grandma want to see you walking around naked around the house? No, right? Or if you're having company, maybe you don't want the ancestors there. Well, then you get a divider and you just fold it up and cover the table. So at that point, they understand that the space is demarked energetically, so they don't go out and peek. And then you take it down when you need to. Like, this makes sense. Like, you think of logic like family dinner at the table, or maybe it's in the living room. It depends how your family is, right? So typically in Chinese culture, you'd be like they have a dead house, but that's not the house altogether, right? And you go to them, and that's their house. And the way I've been taught, I like to be a little more interactive with my ancestors, and I'll sit down with them and be like, "Hey, what up, buds? Life's kind of sucky. Give me some help here." And then you might do some ritual work with them at that point. Now, I do find if people are a magician, you have magician ancestors. That's just a fact. It usually runs through line. Now, that doesn't mean that you're like, oh, like it's not my bloodline. Well, then you can make it. It doesn't matter. People have the same skills that they had in life. You had a doctor person in health or in life, and they're your ancestor. You can have them do healing for you. You had a soldier, then you can have them do military rounds, right? If you had someone that was a weaver, they can do it. So all the skills that they actually had in life apply to you right now. And you can even get that further strengthened if you have a cycle pump or a Lord of the Dead to do the blessing, because usually you want a Lord of the Dead to actually open up the altar and be like, this is your connection, right? So, like, again, For us, when we do those ancestor openings, Andrea is a Hugon. He is the highest initiated uh, priest in the voodoo rank. So this is where we'll work with a Baron, right, and Mama Brigitte, and he'll do the work ritually for all our audience and like for our listeners when we do the meditation and clients. And he'll open up the door to the Lord, the underworld, and then he said, "Can you bring their ancestors through the waters?" Now you have a consecrated altar because the Lord of the Dead blessed it, and that's your portal to the underworld for your ancestors.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point too. Like, because I think a lot of people, listeners of the podcast and stuff like that, we're not all Buddhists, we're not all Taoists, And so I heard one time, don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. I remember I was listening to a gentleman, and he, talked about like magic, magic with a K, right? And he did a lot of that type of work. But he was raised Catholic, and he said his mom was like a Catholic light, like she was Catholic and all that, but she, is the one that taught him like, energetic healing and, working with crystals and all this stuff. And so he just said when he goes in and he does like house clearings, if he's working with, trying to rid of negative spirits and stuff like that, he says he'll use Catholic saints. And he says that his mom told him one time, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, because,
Mm-hmm.
use what you connect to. And so you don't have to throw away all of your own beliefs. It seems like you connect more to like the voodoo tradition. And so use what you connect to. You don't have to do it, because it's like a feng shui type of placement or feng shui type of thing. You work with your intuition and, just study more on what you connect to, what your culture is,
Yeah,
what
and this
what
is
your
where
background is. Yeah.
it really is that. It's kind of like you were like, oh, we got to do this fancy feng shui stuff. And my ancestors are kind of like, we're Chinese. I mean, I could arguably say, like, okay, maybe we have some other things happening, but let's just say we're Chinese, right? But it's
Yeah.
kind of like at that point, what am I going to do? My offerings are going to be rice wine. Why? That's what my ancestors are used to. Okay, there's certain things in life that they like. So it's like, okay, I'll give them Chinese food on different Chinese festivals. Right. So that's kind of like what I'm giving my family because that's what we're used to. But again, if your family's not used to rice, why would you give them rice? Maybe it's coffee, maybe it's whatever food it is. So this is where it's really respecting your culture and your background because that's really where you're coming from. The ancestor altar, the way I describe it, I mean, you can use any Lord of the Dead for that process. It was a very template type of altar I set up, right? In terms of that description. But you can use anything. And as long as it connects to you, you can have different effigies, you can have different things. And everyone's coming from a different background. So it's just really what works for you. The key thing is if you're connecting with your ancestors, do you feel better? Does your life get better? We can measure this if we're doing it correctly.
Gotcha. Just kind of even thinking about ancestors and then talking about, oh, the Catholicism. My grandma was a very devout Catholic, or Hispanic, and so, but I remember in her bedroom talking about, do your ancestors want to see you walking around naked? But she had this, it was a beautiful altar. She had, of course, for Virgin Marys and the candles and stuff, but she had a divider and she would just close that up and close it off, and
Right.
that sticks out in my mind, so yeah, Jesus's
Well,
crucifixes and Last Suppers
absolutely.
everywhere. Yeah.
Well,
And so that
absolutely.
makes me
And
think of
this
my grandmother.
this gets into other practical pieces. A table's a luxury, right? Like, if you don't have a lot of space, like, we can talk about the States, things are bigger down there, things are cheaper than Canada. I can say that for a fact. However, if you're in an apartment complex, the table may not be something you have as a luxury. So then you get a
Yeah.
briefcase, right? Like I remember talking to Andrea about this, and he said, like, hey, use what you got, right? So you
Yes.
don't have a table, you're in a small apartment, get a briefcase, and then that's your altar. When you need it, you open it up. When you don't need it, you close it down.
Yeah. That makes sense. So earlier we talked about the underworld. You mentioned underworld. I think a lot of people have a connotation in their mind, a image in their mind when you say underworld, and they think of like the Hades or the Dante's Inferno or something like that. But when in reality, like in Taoist beliefs, it's more of like kind of different layers, I suppose. So underworld doesn't have a negative connotation. It's more of just kind of a place that you go to. Is that correct? I know, of course, you work with other
Yeah, I
traditions
mean,
too.
this really is this I could say generally cross culturally, the underworld or the deadlands might be a better interpretation. This is just like you're dead. What do you do in the deadlands? Well, people just do their thing, right? This is a point where you're healing, you're trying to figure out things. Ideally, your descendants would bring you back and say, "Hey, let's do exchanges. I'll build you up. You help me in my life, and it's a win-win." Right? Even working with going to the graveyards, you can do the win-win with that. Obviously, there's a lot of training with that. It's not as hard as people think, but it's still some basics you need to know around things. So this is where it's kind of like once you start connecting to the deadlands, what's the one thing around death? Death is all consuming. So you better know how to do some healing work on yourself. Now, working with the ancestors, it's fairly safe. You don't need to worry about that because they have your best interest in hand. But when you just go in and go to a graveyard, the dead don't know. They're just going to latch on and be like, you're alive, you're a star, you can see us. And you're like, yes, and you got to heal and let go of the dead energy. I mean, Yin House Feng Shui, I mean, it's a whole, I don't want to say science, but it's a whole form onto itself of
Oh yeah,
how to
yeah.
frame the world, right? So this is like, what are you trying to do with Yin House Feng Shui? You're not trying, like, this is where I'll say the back end side of things. Chinese culture is a shame culture. So to say, okay, is it a dead friendly culture? No, it's not whatsoever. So this is where you're trying not to piss off the dead. That's what it comes down to with yin health feng shui. You're like, oh, I want to make sure the proportion's right, so I don't piss off my ancestors because the ancestors have a loop to you, and if they're not happy, guess what? You're not happy. So that's kind of the gist of it in a nutshell. But remember, when we're talking about the ancestor altar that I just described, you have an actual relationship with them. So they'll step in and be like, dude's being a dick here. Like, hey, we're stopping that. We have a vested interest. However, in classical times, remember that this was done, your ancestor altar was only done by aristocrats, right? It wasn't done by the normal people. Now you think this
Yeah.
is like, oh, absolutely, everyone should have them. No, not everyone had the luxury of having a table or a space for their ancestors. I mean, this gets back to names, right? Not a lot. Like we all have last names. We're like, yeah, it's this, and this. But really, that was rare in Chinese culture. There's only 100 names historically. So when we're talking about yin hao feng shui, in the conceptualization of that, you are raising your ancestors. So then, because they have a name, you can grow. But this is where a lot of people didn't have names, and that's why they didn't have ancestors. So when we're talking about this yin house feng shui side of things, it is the idea that you are venerating the dead to ward off punishment. Obviously, that's not a good place to be at. So we'll get into technicals, like think about your own house, right? Like if we had to frame your house right now, is there things you want? Like if say you couldn't run your own house, like say someone else structured it for you, would you want a tree in your house busting through the wall? Probably
No.
not. Would you want it wet and with bad piping? Probably not. Like these are things that we kind of take for granted, but we're like, if you frame it that way, you're like, yeah, now I understand why they care about this yin house feng shui, because whatever happens to their house is what happens to the living. So again, the metaphors, I don't want to call it science, but the magic and the metaphors here is like to like. You pick a coffin, you go to do the positions because maybe you want your ancestor to be more glorified. Okay, then you pick a direction to glorify them. Maybe you found them, they like winter, so you face them north. Maybe they like the south, so you face them south. So this really depends on the family orientation. This is based on their personal preferences. But a few solid rules is make sure there's no trees busting through your wall. Make sure that there is a flow of water, but not over top of it, right? Because it's like I don't want a leaky roof, but it's nice to have a stream that I can go kayaking down or canoeing on, right? You give the offer to them so they have food to eat, and then you would usually do exchanges for that, or you put flowers to make it more decorative. You already all do this living anyway. The same rules apply. So with that, that's a very minimalistic viewpoint of the in-house feng shui.
It can
But
get
then you can
complex.
get
Yeah.
it can get very complex, but the complexities don't need to be there. Now you're just saying you're adding metaphorical layers. Now I could be completely heretical on this with feng shui, and people are like, "This is the way it's been done for thousands of years."
Oh yeah. Yeah. I see that so
Right?
much.
This has to be the way. And I would look at them and say, okay. And toilets were the way for how many years too? We didn't have flushable toilets. Yet it's a thing.
Yeah.
Apples are a thing too, right? So this is where technology is always evolving. And if we understand the core principles of what that means, we can adapt. So this is where I'm not big on the dogma of this is the way it's done. There's principles in play. If you understand the principles, you can switch it because it's your interaction with it.
Yeah. Have you experienced anything like that where people have, kept like urns in their home or anything like that, and
Yeah,
they've experienced anything, not particularly, I guess I'm not thinking negative because I don't think that would be a necessarily negative energy, but just a yin energy and maybe experiencing
it's just a yin
activity,
energy.
I suppose.
Again, it's like, again, yin is yin, death is death. But yin is very nourishing. Yin is very supporting, right? These are metaphors that we can
Mhm.
talk about. So when we're talking about urns and we're talking about the cremation process, it's like you can put that anywhere and it wouldn't matter. Now, I know, again, heretically, people are going to be like, dude, what are you talking about? Right? You can't put the urn in the fire quadrants and blah blah blah. I'm like, well, if the person was very good at social media and they were very celebrity like, yeah, I won't put them in fire
Right?
because
Yeah.
they're going to be very good there. Right. So this is again, it's like you need to know your loved one when you're talking about that. Where would they fit most comfortable? Different schools of feng shui are going to have different places. They're usually going to say put it in possibly like metal corners, right?
Mhm.
Because that correlates to the dead. Maybe like again, depending on how you look, maybe it's water, but honestly, it does not matter. You should have one area and you should just give them that location. Is it yin energy? Yes. Does it matter ultimately? No, because it's your connection to your loved one, right? So that's really the key thing is you're connecting to your loved ones. That's already transforming the aspect of yin.
Yeah, and I do think just even the process of having them there, honoring them, and then just keeping it in a space that's nice, that that they would like, which is nice. I know we're in the process right now of burying my father-in-law. He passed in 2019, and my sister-in-law has him, but when she moves, and I feel like he's not stable, and so I we bought a slot for him. And when I bought the space, I made sure I did the feng shui on it, and I did a specific calculation that I've learned. But yeah, I really did. Me and my husband stood there for a little bit, and we're like, "Does this is a really pretty view? It's kind of up on a hill a little bit." Has a view of the water, really, it's the oldest cemetery in my town, trees off to all around, really pretty. And so, yeah, he was like, he would like this. Perfect. Let's go
Yeah,
for it. And
and
so we
that's really
selected
where
that
you're
spot.
looking for,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like the spot matters because it's like okay, like when people are like spots don't matter, it's like they kind of do matter because it's who's going there, right? So if you're like, well, screw it, just throw them in the grave, we're done, and they're like, I'd be pissed off too, right? At that point, it's
Yeah.
like, did
Yeah.
you really honor me? Like, you want me to help you? Like, it's not going to happen at that point. Like, you gotta just view it from a simple lens of like, would they like it in life? If they don't, then they probably wouldn't like it in death.
Yeah, I think people get hung up on the method. And I mean, even though it's like I may use a certain method, you may use a certain method, or other whoever uses a certain method. Again, you just have to trust that you're using your best intention. You have to trust that you're doing the best you can with the knowledge you have. And yeah, and that it's gonna turn out good. I think a lot of people get hung up on the how-tos and the specifics and the lineage. I've seen like arguments with lineage and all kinds of fluctuate. Oh my gosh, it's crazy, but I've seen some crazy stuff. But but yeah,
Oh
I think
yeah,
it's
yeah.
again just we have to know that we're doing the best we can with what we have, and people have different methods. That yeah. It can change their life in a bunch of different ways, just shifting that paradigm, thinking about it, and just trying
Hmm.
things. So try some
Yeah,
ancestor work.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that
Try
really
some
intrigued me to
ancestor
try
work.
some. Yeah, yeah.
I
Well, I
mean, try
really
some
appreciate
ancestor
you.
work. I mean, really, it's just like, you're connecting. If you have a photo, you have a memory, that's a good enough start, right? If they loved you in life, they'll love you in death. That's all you just gotta meditate and just be like, okay, here's the table. I may not know a Lord of the Dead. I may not know a cycle pump spirit. That's okay. But you know your ancestor, and that's enough to kind of understand. So you can just imagine how they were, and they'll come forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Again, that's kind of intrigued me to try some things. So if people want to get a hold of you, where can they find you? I'm going to put links on the show notes, but you do have a YouTube channel, which is where I discovered you.
Yep. Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole is the podcast. The video cast on YouTube is called Queen City Curio Videocast. So this is where I'm co-hosting with Andrea, and Andrea is the lead co-host on things. We bring in authors and we talk about different occult metaphysics in a practical, results-driven manner. We also have our store. If you're in Toronto, or we ship internationally too. Like we have a lot of American buyers that support us, so thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate you. If anybody needs to get a hold of you, again, that link will be in the show notes and they'll be able to get a hold of you that way. Really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, Ancestor Worship, Honoring Our Ancestors, and Feng Shui for Burial with Zac Lui. We talked about all things in between, also very fascinating subject, topic, and again, hope to have Zac on the show for further topics, Chinese medicine, all kinds of stuff. So you guys check the link in the show notes if you're interested in following Zac's work also. And he has some cool stuff. If you're in his area, definitely check out the website because, again, just some neat events that they host quite frequently, it would seem. So I'll catch you guys next week for Feng Shui of a haunted house. What do we look for to know if a house is going to be haunted from a Feng Shui aspect? So I'll catch you guys next week for our spooky episode. You guys have an amazing weekend. For a free energy mapping of your floor plan, please check the link in the show notes. To support today's podcast, go to learnfengshui.com, sign up for emails, leave a review, and share with your family and friends.